Historical Society, and welcoming you all on behalf of the Historical Society and the Friends of the Sherburne Library, who are co-sponsors of tonight's final joint program of the season. The 400+ year history of Anglo-American, Native American relations is complicated and catastrophic, replete with such extreme brutality that even many American history devotees are prone to leave it overlooked or only partially examined. For the general population, it may even be entirely forgotten. Yet whether we consciously realize it or not, the choices our ancestors made centuries ago, and arguably the ones that we continue to make in 2026, are deeply influenced by the series of terrible events we now call King Philip's War, the subject of tonight's program. On the 350th anniversary of that New England conflict, we welcome Eric Schultz, the author of 4 books, including King Philip's War, The History and Legacy of America's Forgotten Conflict, co-written with Michael Tougias. Mr. Schultz is the former chair of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, the Gettysburg Foundation, and currently serves as the director of the Old Colony History Museum in Taunton. And native of Dighton, he holds a BA in history from Brown and an MBA from Harvard Business School. He and his wife, Susan, live in Boxford. Great. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's good to hang out with a high school history teacher, believe me. And by the way, that tree in front of this library is spectacular. Even if you never checked out a book, it would be worth visiting. But anyway, thanks for having me this evening. I'm going to make sure okay. Oops. What are you seeing? Are you seeing? Yeah, I've lost my meeting. Yeah, let me try that. Oops. Everything was going so well a minute ago.
Just like the old days when we had slide projectors.
Yeah. I have everyone who's well, I can't do a soft shoe, so let me just say it's great to be here with you tonight. I appreciate all Kevin's help and his support. What I'm going to do is we'll talk about the war, what happened before the war, some of the events. I won't try to cover them all because there's a lot of the war itself, and then some of the after effects of the war. But so much has happened since I wrote the book in 1999. Mike and I wrote the book, but I also want to cover some of the subsequent scholarship, the newer stuff that's come out. And it's changed a lot. The interpretation of the war has changed a lot. So I will be, if your Kindle's not already full, there may be a few more books that you want to pile into it. My wife says that it's great. My wife says if the books weighed as much on my Kindle as they did in real life, I'd need a forklift truck to carry it around. So our book was published nearly 30 years ago. Can I ask your help with just one more thing? And we called it America's Forgotten Conflict. And I think some of this newer scholarship that I've talked about will show you why it's been less forgotten now. I've got that band there that I can't read my whole. Okay. There you go. Thank you. Great. Okay. So the war today is, I think, much less forgotten. It had the bad, if you will, the problem of being exactly 100 years before the American Revolution. So while people are celebrating the Tea Party and the shot heard around the world, some of what happened in King Philip's War kind of goes underground because it just wasn't quite as an important event, but it was important. You may know that the war began about 50 miles south of here in Swansea in June of 1675. So this is the second year of the 350th commemoration. And your town, Sherborne, was incorporated in 1674 on the eve of the war. And I think of your town as one of the so-called mother towns of Massachusetts, like Plymouth and like Dedham and like Taunton. These were all towns that began as these enormous, awkwardly shaped buffer zones that protected people like Increase Mather and William Hubbard from what they considered to be the real frontier. Taunton's a good example. It was a classic frontier buffer town between Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoag lands, and from it, Dighton, Easton, Norton, Raynham, and Berkeley will all eventually emerge. And this formula is going to repeat itself all over New England. The English population is growing, the frontier expands, farms get closer and closer to these traditional hunting and fishing grounds of the native population, and at the same time, people get tired of walking so far to church on the Sabbath, so they petition to form a new town, and gradually these big towns get carved up. But that also means at the time of the war, they're especially vulnerable because they are thinly populated. Sherborne split from Medfield on the eve of the war, and it was clearly contested ground, this area right here. As many of you know, the original Sherborne will become modern Sherborne, Framingham, Holliston, Dover, and Millis, which also shares parts of Medfield and Medway. So at the start of King Philip's War, Sherborne was a second-generation frontier town, thinly populated, very exposed. Not a constantly fought over battlefield, but it sat in a very vulnerable corridor stretching westward into Nipmuc country and south toward Narragansett country. Your town was also adjacent, as you know, to Natick, which was founded in 1651 as one of John Eliot's original Christian Indian, or what we call praying Indian towns. And they were mistrusted and badly mistreated during the war. They, in fact, were sent to a concentration camp on Deer Island. So Natick is a major flashpoint near this land. We're not going to have a Mary Rowlandson here like we do in Lancaster, and we're not going to have a well-documented conflict like we do in Medfield or Sudbury, but it was still a very important part of the war. And the men who lived here served in militias in all the adjacent towns. So the big picture is this: in 1675, the frontier of Mass Bay Colony included Dunstable, Groton, Lancaster, Marlborough, Mendon, Sherborne, Medfield, and Wrentham. And then there were these two little isolated outposts out here. Worcester had about 7 families, and Brookfield or Quaboag Plantation had about 20. And then there were a string of exposed settlements along the Connecticut River Valley, from Northfield all the way down to Simsbury, Connecticut. And that would be the only town in Connecticut that gets attacked during the war, in Connecticut Colony. And in Plymouth Colony, the frontier towns were Dartmouth, Rehoboth, and Swansea when the war begins. And all three will be attacked, and there will be death and damage in all three. And then you might say all of modern Rhode Island and New Hampshire and Maine were contested areas during the war. Okay, before we place the Native Americans on this map, I wanted to provide some context about the history of the war. I don't know how many of you use Ngram, but you put the term King Philip's War into Google's Ngram, it tracks the books and articles, the general interest in a topic over time, and you'll note that the war had a spike in interest beginning about 1875 and lasting until about 1915. Okay, there are a lot of memorials and a lot of dedications during this period, which not coincidentally corresponds with Frederick Jackson Turner telling Americans that the frontier is gone and the end of the so-called Indian Wars out west. So, for example, the Great Swamp Fight was commemorated in 1906. In 1912, we have these great pictures of Lancaster actually reenacting the attack on their town. And the best history of the war, I think, during this period was by George Ellis and John Morris. It's a 1906 book. It's chronological. They're Connecticut River Valley historians. It compiled English colonial sources into some coherent narrative. But what I liked best about it was that it embraced this new technology of photography. So if you pick up the book, and it's easy to find in a used bookstore, you have all these pictures from 1906 of sites related to King Philip's War. And then you see a second peak of interest at the 250th anniversary of the war around 1925. And after that, writing about the war gets really quiet from World War II until the 21st century. And that explains the subtitle of our book, America's Forgotten War. Now, if you poke around a little bit more on Ngram, and I don't advise this because you'll be there all day if you do, because it's a lot of fun, you'll see what else was happening. The writing about World War II and about Vietnam also spiked during this period, which pushed all the other wars down, so to speak. There was a lot of literature published about those too. However, there was a really important book published in this quiet period by Norton in 1966, Douglas Edward Leach's Flintlock and Tomahawk. I think of Professor Leach's book as the most comprehensive retelling of the war. It was the high watermark of military history, and it was my gateway book to the war. It's what got me interested. But when I finished Flintlock and Tomahawk, however, I began to wonder, where was everything I just read about? Because one of the best ways for me to understand history is to establish a sense of place, to be in the room where it happened, or to try to find the field or the garrison where it happened. So I made it my mission to find as many garrisons, camps, ambushes, and battles as I could. And when I began my research in April of 1991, there was no GPS, there was no iPhone, there was no Google, no Wikipedia, and no digitized archive. So if you wanted to write a travelogue, you had to travel. Wanting to know the location of events in King Philip's War was a product of having grown up not far south from here in the little town of North Dighton, on land acquired from King Philip. And from my home, if I walked in this direction, I would get to the Wampanoag Council Oak in central Dighton. And if I walked in that direction, I'd be at something called King Philip's Oak in Taunton. And I would come home on the bus from Dighton Rehoboth Regional High School and go by a place called Anawan Rock. And it would take a few years, but eventually I would get all these places together in my mind. I also got a boost when I studied history at Brown because I took a material culture course from Professor James Dietz, who was the assistant director at the Plymouth Plantation at the time. And in class, Professor Dietz talked all about this thing called King Philip's War. And one day he put us on a bus and we visited Brown's Half-and-Refer Museum. At that time, it was in Bristol, Rhode Island, the homeland of the Pokanoket. And it was another experience of my being in the room that really stuck with me. Some of you may know that in November of 2024, Brown returned about 200 acres of its Mount Hope property, including the old Half-and-Refer building, to the Pokanoket. Okay, back to Engram for one last look. We've got Ellison Morris in 1906 with all their great photos, and Leach in 1966 with this valuable military history. And then in 1998 comes Jill Lepore, right, with The Name of War. And her thesis was that the war was fought twice, right? Once on the ground and then once in memory and in narrative. And that second fighting was almost as important in the first in the way it shaped our country and our culture. And then we added our book about 6 months later, which really brought location to the forefront, which was sort of a premonition of things that were about to come. And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention Nat Philbrick's book, Mayflower, the second half of which, it should have been called Mayflower and King Philip's War, because the second half is all about King Philip's War, and it brought the war to a whole new set of readers. But the very newest books about the war, which published after we published, have changed our interpretation significantly. And I want to highlight this change by mentioning just 3 books to you. The first was written in 2018 by Lisa Brooks. She's a historian and professor at Amherst College, Our Beloved Kin. And as the name implies, it uses kinship and family alliances and political networks, along with geography and oral tradition, to reinterpret the war. Like Jill Lepore's book, it also won the Bancroft Prize. Brooks focuses on Weetamo or Weetamo. When I first heard Weetamo, it sounded like a breakfast cereal. So I heard someone say Weetamo, and I like that better. The sachem of the Pocasset. And Philip's sister-in-law. She's also Philip's sister-in-law, and highlights her contributions that are often overlooked in the older traditional literature. So if kinship is important, and I do a lot of genealogy to understanding the war, let's do a little bit of genealogy to situate the indigenous peoples in this war. Here's a simplified version of Usamequin's genealogy. Usamequin's title was Massasoit. That's how we know him, meaning Grand Sachem. He was a Pokanoket, but he was Grand Sachem of several sub-tribes, all of which historians much later called Wampanoag. But he wouldn't have told you he was a Wampanoag. He would have said, I'm a Pokanoket. Right? Wamsutta was his oldest son in blue. Metacom was his second son in blue. And then he had a third son and 2 daughters. And many historians believe that this was Massasoit's second family, the first being wiped out by a pandemic that we'll talk about in a moment. Massasoit's oldest son, Wamsutta, would be given the name of Alexander by the English. He married Weetamo, who was the sachem of the Pocasset, and they're in modern-day Tiverton and Fall River, Tiverton, Rhode Island, Fall River, Massachusetts. And that's where Dr. Brooks focuses. Weetamo and her people will fight alongside Philip. She will drown in the Taunton River at Somerset, trying to escape English soldiers in about August of 1676, just before Philip's death. And her head was stuck on a pike in Taunton. It was a gruesome tactic used by both sides to strike fear in the other side. But it was also an indication of her influence and power, because the same thing will happen to Philip. His head will be stuck on a pike in Plymouth. And if you know your English history, you know that Sir Thomas More's head was stuck on a pike by Henry VIII, and Oliver Cromwell's head was stuck on a pike at Westminster for 25 years, and even Blackbeard's head got stuck on a pike. So while it is a gruesome practice, it was also an indication of stature and status, and reinforces Dr. Brooks' argument about the importance of Weetamo. Massasoit's second son is Metacom, of course. You know him as Philip. He married Wutuna Kanusk, and Wapsutta and Metacom's wives were sisters, the daughter of the sachem Corbitant of the Pocasset. Usamiquan and Corbitant were often at odds, so two sisters marrying two brothers bound these families together in peace and in war. It also reminds us again of the relative stature of a sachem like Weetamo. She had been the queen, so to speak, of Wapsutta. Shortly after becoming sachem, and just after Massasoit's death in 1661, Wapsutta requested of Plymouth that he and his brother be given English names, perhaps to signify a new period in their life, perhaps to make it easier for them in this world of treaties and commerce. So the English came up with Alexander and Philip, ancient leaders of Macedonia. Jill Lepore suggested in her book that the names would have an obvious meaning for the English at the time. It's embedded in our seal of Massachusetts here. It's an engraving of an Indian mouthing the words, "Come over and help us," which is based on the book of Acts 16:9, in which a vision appeared to the apostle Paul in the night. There stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, saying, "Come over into Macedonia and help us." So colonial authorities saw both Indians and Macedonians as pagans, desperate for the gospel. So the names Alexander and Philip were meaningful, but probably not to ridicule them as much as to reinforce a subservient relationship. Toward the end of the war, Philip's wife and their son, Meetom, were captured. We are told that Meetom was sold into slavery. Selling Native Americans into slavery in Barbados and Bermuda and Jamaica was a horrible legacy of the war, but it was meant to eliminate any future threat to English colonists and to pay for war expenses. However, in Meetom's case, there is a strong oral tradition among the Pokanoket that he was befriended by a family in the Caribbean and returned to Connecticut, where he married and had children. And in fact, their oral tradition says that Meetom's grandson was Simeon Simons, an attaché and bodyguard of George Washington. The older historians would dismiss this out of hand. I'm not sure we can do that so much anymore. Some of you might know that Brown University is home to Stolen Relations, a collaborative effort to build a database of the enslaved and unfree indigenous peoples across all the Americas. The director of Stolen Relations is Linford Fisher. He has a book about the wholesale enslavement. There were 600,000 people sold into slavery in North America alone. I cannot recommend the book. I just downloaded it to my Kindle and I haven't read it yet, but I suspect it's a good one. And then Massasoit's daughter, Amy, married Tispaquin, who fought in the war alongside Philip. Amy's genealogy is documented in this 1878 monograph written by Freetown historian and Civil War general Ebenezer Pierce. This genealogy is free, online, available, and Amy's descendants made their home in the Betty's Neck section of Lakeville near Long Pond. If you visit Lakeville, you can find a small, peaceful graveyard, the Royal Wampanoag Cemetery. It includes some of Massasoit's descendants through Amy's line, and the last burial was there in 1812. So Professor Brooks' underlying message is just because we don't have indigenous written sources, it doesn't mean they did not have a voice. You just have to look for evidence in different places. One is in family and kinship ties. And if you're interested in more, but maybe don't want to do any more reading right now, like me, there's a great video online under Amherst Reads where she's interviewed about her book. Also published in 2018, Christina DeLucia's Memory Lands uses kinship, memory, and oral history to recover indigenous voices in the war. She says there is an unbroken Native history which survives in public commemoration and contemporary Native presence. The word that is used now is survivance. It's an old legal term that fell out of use, but Native survivance means having an active presence, a continuation of Native stories, and not just being a victim or reacting to the traditional story. I like the word, it's a combination of survival and endurance. Which brings us to the third new book I would recommend, which was written by Linda Coombs, who is a living example of Native survivance. Linda is a historian from the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead, or Aquinnah. Her book is Colonization and the Wampanoag Story, with a special focus on the years before King Philip's War, which, as I have strayed far from the story, and you have been patient as I ramble, puts us back to where we want to be, because Linda addresses several topics in her book that lead up to the war. The first is the doctrine of discovery. It's 1452, Pope Nicholas V decreed that Christians could capture, enslave, and take all the property of the enemies of Christ. If you were a pagan, you were an enemy. He was really speaking to the Portuguese who were colonizing Africa. The English won't begin planting towns in the New World for another 170 years. And the Puritans wanted little to do with the Pope. But the doctrine of discovery, as the historians say, will survive the Reformation and become foundational to how Europeans in the colonial period, and later under Chief Justice John Marshall, Americans in our continental push west, will treat the indigenous peoples. Second, Linda addresses the Great Dying, which is the story of a disease, we're not sure what it was, thought to have been brought to Maine by European fishermen in 1616. This sickness, to which America's native population had no immunity, swept through the middle of Wampanoag country, resulting in a death rate between 75 and 90%. Prior to the pandemic, Linda believes, the Wampanoag Nation had about 70 villages of maybe 1,000 each, so maybe 70,000 people. If we use an 80% death rate, that's 56,000 deaths out of the 70,000. And if they died in a 2-year period, that's 83 people every day. A village of 1,000 people would disappear in 2 weeks. That's what the Pilgrims found, vacant land, when they arrived in 1620. And there is nothing that will determine the outcome of King Philip's War more decisively than the Great Dying, which occurred nearly 60 years before the first blood is shed in Swansea. In the next decades after the Great Dying, New England experiences the Great Migration, a lot of greats in those days. In 1630, Charles I had dissolved Parliament. That's going to cost him his head, of course, leaving Puritan leaders suddenly more vulnerable to persecution. One response was to form the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in 1630, 11 ships led by John Winthrop carried about 1,000 Puritans from England to New England, the Boston area, the first of some 20,000 men, women, and children who would migrate over the next decade. It turned out the conditions in the New World were much healthier than in the cities of Europe, too. New England had clean water. It had a more dispersed population, meaning 6 to 8 English children per family could survive infancy. So New England's Native Americans weren't just devastated by European disease, they also faced a population that was growing rapidly through immigration and through America's first baby boom. So I have averaged the population estimates for both English and Native Americans in southern New England. These numbers are not accurate, but when I was in business, we used to say things that we didn't know were true were directionally correct. So these are directionally correct, I think. And I focused on southern New England, which is our focus tonight. And in 1620, as a result of the Great Dying, there were perhaps 25,000 Native Americans who had survived this horrific plague. And we know there are 100 English clinging to life in Plymouth. 20 years later, thanks to the Great Migration and additional smallpox outbreaks, the population numbers are roughly equal. I believe 1640 was about the last time the natives might have been able to fight the English to a draw, or perhaps push them back to the coast in the Atlantic and off their ancestral lands. But 35 years later, when the war begins, thanks to a colonial baby boom and continued immigration, the population is tipped decisively in favor of the English. If you assume 1 in 4 people was a man of fighting age, New England's indigenous people may have had 3,500 warriors and the English 13,000. We often say Massasoit presided over 40 years of peace before his death in 1661, but it was a very costly, very lopsided peace. And not just in these population numbers. During this period, the English will create 80 towns. And everywhere they erected these huge invisible boundaries, and large chunks of land like Taunton and Sherborne, they also declared sovereignty, right? English law, English court, English justice, all shaped by a papal pronouncement from 1452 and now reinforced by overwhelming population numbers. So the Native American tribes that will prosecute the war in southern New England were the Wampanoag. As I said, probably an invented name after, so we didn't have to go through Nemaska and Pocasset and Sakonnet and so forth. And they will be the Pokanoket, which I talked about in Bristol and Warren, Rhode Island, the Pocasset in Fall River and Tiverton, the Nemasket in Middleborough, some of the Nauset on Cape Cod, and early in the war, the Sakonnet in Little Compton. And then the Nipmuc will join in central Massachusetts, as well as the Pecumtuck along the Connecticut River. And then joining the coalition in December of 1675 were the Narragansett. And for some reason, this plague had sort of burned itself out as it got to Narragansett Bay. We're not exactly sure why. So they turned out to be the strongest of the tribes at the time of King Philip's War. And then into the north, later in the war, the Abenaki will join in. So the Massachusetts-speaking people, where I come from, Essex County, right, were pretty much wiped out. So the Agawam, the Namkeeg, the Pawtucket, they were hit hardest. And so there's very little action in Boxford and North Andover and Topsfield and sort of my neck of the woods during this war because there just aren't a lot of Native Americans left in that area. The Pequot and the Mohegan will fight alongside the English. Some of you know there was a Pequot War in 1636. They join in, and the Pennacook will remain neutral, as will many of the Wampanoag who made their home on Cape Cod and the islands. King Philip's War was fought 55 years after the arrival of the Mayflower and a century to the year before the American Revolution. That march to the American Revolution was really a much larger pattern of conflict that would determine whether the English, the Dutch, the French, or Native Americans would be sovereign over this part of North America. If you were born in 1670 and lived through the run-up to the American Revolution, you would have been in a nearly constant state of war. At the time of King Philip's War, there was Plymouth Colony, what we call today the Old Colony, led by Josiah Winslow, the son of Edward. Massachusetts Bay Colony, led by Governor John Leverett, who was a veteran of the English Civil War, one of the few real soldiers on the English side. He fought with distinction under Cromwell. And Connecticut was led by Governor John Winthrop Jr. They called him Winthrop the Lesser. And then there were a bunch of cast-offs that will become Rhode Island, who also contributed to the war effort. So, as I mentioned, 1661, Massasoit died of natural causes after presiding over 40 years of this lopsided peace with the English. The peace was made even more difficult by the relentless attempts to convert the Native Americans to Christianity, which by drawing young men from the tribe was another way for the English to establish greater numbers and sovereignty. And at Massasoit's death, his oldest son, Wamsutta, or Alexander, became Grand Sachem, the Massasoit. Wamsutta had been trained for this role, and he had governed alongside his father. The transition also marks, in my mind, the moment when the personal bonds between the first comers, the really earliest pilgrims in Plymouth, and Massasoit and his generation start to dissolve, and people don't know each other as well afterwards. The following year, in 1662, Wamsutta was forcibly forced to answer charges of the unauthorized sale of land and rumors of an armed uprising with the Narragansett. He's captured by, at that time, General, soon to be Governor Josiah Winslow. And after being questioned, Wamsutta became suddenly and violently ill while returning to his home in Rhode Island. We do not know what happened. One modern doctor says that Wamsutta's symptoms resembled appendicitis. But at least some of the Pokanoket believed that Wamsutta had been poisoned by the English because he had become an obstacle to their acquisition of land, and he was a threat to their peace. Wamsutta's hunting lodge was located near White Island in Halifax. There was a historical marker commemorating his capture. So with Wamsutta's death, Philip, the second son, was suddenly and unexpectedly the Massasoit, the Grand Sachem. The next important event leading up to the war was the so-called Taunton Agreement, signed at the Meeting House at present-day Church Green, home today of this First Parish Church. This so-called agreement forced Philip to give up his guns, to which he agreed only under threat and never fully honored. He was treated poorly. He was outgunned and embarrassed in front of his own people at this meeting. Philip, I don't think, was ever in a position to project the kind of power or gravitas or stature of his father or even his brother Wamsutta. he had a disadvantage right from the start. The scene is depicted in New England Mutual Life Insurance Company's 1900 promotional calendar. It's a beautiful engraving, but it's not very historical, as Philip is dressed like a 19th century Plains Indian. And it falls into that period, if you remember in Engram, you might recall, when interest in King Philip was especially high. If you visit the Museum of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery at Faneuil Hall in Boston, you can also see a painting of this reconstructed scene of the Taunton Agreement. And if you visit the First Parish Church, the site of the meeting house, you will find the Williams Memorial stained glass window, which also shows the scene. This image is equally inaccurate to the promotional calendar, and as my friend says, it's beautiful mythology. So along with Wamsutter's sudden death and this disastrous Taunton Agreement, the third event that really triggered the war related to the death was related to the death of John Sassamon. Sassamon was this interesting character. He was a Massachusetts, born around Blue Hills. He attended Harvard. He converted to Christianity, and he served as a translator for the Pokanoket. He traveled back and forth between cultures and was thought to have warned the English about a possible native uprising. So he was discovered in January of 1675 under the ice at Assawampset Pond in Lakeville, believed to have been ice fishing and simply have fallen in. But shortly after, a Pokanoket informer told the English that it was murder. You can see the informer back there behind the tree of this. Plymouth had a trial, very much a kangaroo court. 3 of Philip's men were convicted, and they were hanged. 2 were hanged and 1 was shot. Quite likely, or quite possibly, none of them guilty. So John Sassamon's trial would be the event that convinced Philip, if the poisoning of his brother and the lopsided Taunton Agreement hadn't already, that he could never receive justice from the English. Professor Yasuhide Kawashima is a legal historian at the University of Texas. In 2001, he wrote a book about the events surrounding the trial and the nature of English justice and how it was applied or misapplied to Native Americans. He says in the Sassamon trial, the prosecution's case for murder was weak, and the key witness was problematic, and the English knew that, but the war has to be understood not just as a conflict over land, but as a collision of legal systems and sovereignty. Okay, so as we begin talking about the war and its sites, just a word of caution. It's what I call my Washington slept here warning. There are many sites and artifacts attributed to King Philip. Rocks, lots of caves, trees, lookouts, war clubs, even chairs. Just be appropriately skeptical. And I'm not picking on any particular object or site or town, but some of these stories first appeared in sermons and town histories during the bicentennial celebrations in the 19th century, usually based on local tradition. That first spike you saw in the engram, when towns were suddenly anxious to be associated with King Philip. If that seems a little odd to you, my reading of Philip is that he's gone through 4 very distinct transformations in American history. First, he was demonized, as we do with a lot of our enemies. But after the Revolution, when Americans began to see virtue in a leader who was protecting his homeland from invaders, Philip was romanticized. And we see this on Broadway, in Washington Irving with James Fenimore Cooper. Jill Lepore does a nice section on this in her book. And this is when the town histories are written and you start to see the King Philip slept here artifacts and caves and lookouts. Then with the rise of the American mass market and advertising in the 20th century, Philip and Native Americans generally were commercialized. I'll show you more in a minute on that. And today, Philip is being, I think, humanized. I needed another "ized," so that was the one that worked, I think, by scholars like Linda Coombs and Lisa Brooks and Christine DeLucia. So when in doubt, when I was doing my research for the travelogue, I relied on the accounts of those writers who lived during the war. One of the first printed histories was done by Boston's Nathaniel Saltonstall. You may recognize that. He would be a judge at the Salem witch trials and go head-to-head with Increase Mather. Saltonstall's observations were published in London in December 1675, right at the start of the war. And he tells it like it is. His work provided one of the earliest detailed descriptions highlighting English losses and destruction and the ineptness of the colonial leaders. And then in February, a Rhode Island Quaker by the name of John Easton found a publisher in London for his narrative, which also cast the English in a negative light. So when Boston's minister, Increase Mather, read these 2 accounts, he was outraged. He thought they were full of errors and did not reflect well on Winthrop's City Upon a Hill. So in early 1676, he began writing his own history, in which the war was nothing more than a test of God's elect. Mather rushed his manuscript to printers and in August 1676 published in Boston and London his brief history of the war with the Indians in New England, together with his serious exhortations. And Mather exhorted a lot in this book. The other reason Mather rushed his manuscript was that the Reverend William Hubbard, the minister at Ipswich, was also writing a history, and this one had been endorsed by colonial authorities to make sure that their version of the war was properly presented. Hubbard's history was more complete, it's more accurate, often relying on the firsthand accounts of soldiers. So by 1682, readers had available 21 contemporary accounts of the war, including the first colonial bestseller, The Captivity and Narrative of Mary Rowlandson. The other important source for location came along much later in 1740, the entertaining history of Benjamin Church of Little Compton, probably dictated to his son Thomas, and perhaps embellished by the distant memories of a dying veteran, but it's still an important firsthand account. So when I was trying to locate a place or event associated with the war, if Mather, Hubbard, Church, Saltonstall, Eastern, or Rowlandson mentioned a landmark or a location, I took it as among the more reliable sources. And by the way, none of them ever mentioned a cave. If the first time a site was mentioned was in a sermon at the bicentennial in 1876, and you know ministers were the historians in those days, or the anniversary in 1926, I was more skeptical. So let me give you a quick example. This was King Philip's oak that grew on Somerset Ave in Taunton. I mentioned it to you. In 1926, at the 250th anniversary, the Daughters of the American Revolution placed a plaque on the tree commemorating it as a spot where Philip and his people met. In 1973, the tree started dropping limbs, became a danger to the public. So a decade later, the city's park department was forced reluctantly to take it down. People were very upset. After all, this was a direct living link to King Philip. But when they counted the rings on this beautiful tree, they found that it had been planted about a century after Philip died. We don't know what Philip looked like. There was no image made of him that when he was alive that we have today, but that hasn't stopped us from drawing pictures of him. The image in the middle is owned by the Haffenreffer, and they were kind enough to let us use it on our first hardcover edition. The painting in the middle was done by Thomas Hart Benton in 1922, the organic Philip. As I mentioned, in 20th century marketing, images of Philip were used to sell beer and chewing gum, coffee and tobacco, cigars, clipper ships and banks, pickles, spring water, and even Kellogg's cereal. And as you can see on these labels, marketeers in the 20th century were doing what New England Mutual did in its 1900 promotional calendar, which was relying on Geronimo or Crazy Horse or some other 19th century model for their image of a 17th century sachem. It would be like using Ulysses S. Grant as a model for Benjamin Church. The most famous of Philip's images was done by Paul Revere in 1772. Historians wondered where Revere dreamed up this rather unattractive image. And in the 1950s, a historian by the name of Brad Swan visited the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester and spotted hanging on the wall a mezzotint called the Four Kings of Canada. It's a display of four Mohawk chiefs who visited London in 1710. Here are two of them. Now you can see what Revere did. We would call it a mashup today, but he borrowed from each of those to create and combine into his image of Philip. If we're not sure what Philip looked like, we're even less sure of what he was thinking during the war. We're not entirely sure what role he played in strategy or tactics, in which battles he participated. But one thing seems clear. We don't believe that he would start a war in June, the middle of fishing and growing season, and before harvest. So when the war broke out in Swansea in June of 1675, it may well have been without his consent, more a product of outrage among his people over the execution of John Sassamon's alleged killers. After homes in Swansea were vandalized by Pokanoket warriors, Englishman John Salisbury shot and killed one of the Pokanoket. In retaliation, Salisbury and 8 others were killed. The old Miles Garrison in Swansea became the first center of action. Unfortunately, the structure is now gone, burned to the ground in 1908, but we know its location, and you can visit the site, which is memorialized. By the way, English soldiers defended Swansea by gathering in the garrisons instead of going out patrolling. And I have to say, I don't blame them. But this era allowed the natives to infiltrate towns, like Medfield would happen later, but certainly like Swansea. Every time a door was open, an English soldier was shot, and when they rushed out, they were caught in ambushes. Once violence began in Swansea, events took on a life of their own. English troops tried to trap Philip and his warriors on the Mount Hope Peninsula, but he was too fast and too smart. He was also probably better armed. We now know that Native Americans readily adopted the flintlock prior to the war and used it frequently for hunting. They knew how to use the weapon. The English soldiers were mainly farmers and merchants who possessed the older, less reliable matchlock technology, which you actually had to light in order to fire the gun. So the Pokanoket were not only more familiar with the terrain and the landscape, they were more skilled with the superior European technology than the English. And the fighting throughout the war will bear this out. There's an excellent book by Dr. Patrick Malone. He's a retired professor at Brown. He wrote a treatise about how warfare might have unfolded in King Philip's War. It's called The Skulking Way of War. Skulking was not considered gentlemanly warfare. Men were supposed to stand and face each other in volleys. But the English are going to learn its value, the value of surprise, of ambush, of intimidation, and of skulking during King Philip's War. And when we decide to become Americans a century later, what we just celebrated in Lexington, we will use skulking effectively against the British. William Hubbard was so incensed with this skulking style of war that, unlike Increase Mather's brief history of the war on the left, Hubbard refused to dignify the atrocities he recorded as real war, instead calling his book a narrative of the troubles with the Indians. From Swansea, the war will spread to Taunton, Middleborough, and Mendon. Taunton was first attacked in June 1675. Several townsmen were killed, but the first and most famous was Edward Bobbitt, or the Babbitt family now, who was living in modern-day Berkeley, Massachusetts. Not long after, Bobbitt's neighbors placed a crude gravestone near the spot of his death. That artifact was rescued in 1912, again, right in that engram spike, sweet spot, when the Babbitt Family Association decided they wanted to honor their ancestor. They knew the stone existed, but they didn't know exactly where it was. So they searched and they ended up having to pry it out of a stone wall. It's a good example of how the needs of modern life and building a stone wall is grueling labor sometimes overwhelm our desire to preserve history. Later, the stone was given to the Old Colony History Museum for safekeeping and display. And the site of Bobbitt's death was later rededicated by the family. In July, Middleborough was attacked. The townspeople gathered for protection at the old fort, which was located near the former Memorial High School. Their leader was John Thompson, who had brought along his so-called long gun. This interesting firearm, it's a fowling piece. It actually sat on a V, and you would use it to kill ducks, basically. Is displayed today next to the Bobbitt stone at Old Colony. It's part of a myth that involves this beautiful petroglyph called Hand Rock nearby, which we write about in our book. Also in July, Mendon was destroyed and abandoned, the first town in Massachusetts Bay to be attacked. So Mass Bay can no longer say this is Plymouth's problem. It's now everyone's problem. It won't be resettled again until the 1680s. The Nipmuc lead this attack, so they are definitively in the war alongside the Wampanoag, and they bring numbers and some very able commanders. Governor Leverett and Mass Bay were not fully convinced that the Nipmuc had joined the war on the side of the Wampanoag, so Leverett sent a party under Captains Hutchinson and Wheeler to try to negotiate neutrality with the Nipmuc in what is today New Braintree. Instead, their party was ambushed. 8 English soldiers were killed, 5 were wounded. Wheeler survived, and a few months later wrote a first-hand account of this ambush with enough clues to allow historians over the years to find 3 possible locations for the ambush. And we included Wheeler's first-hand account in our book. Local historian Jeff Fisk wrote a careful review of all the clues. 30 years ago, he took me to those 3 likely locations, a search which I detail in the book. The survivors of this ambush race out of New Braintree back to Quaboag Plantation, which is today's West Brookfield. The Nipmuc laid siege to Ayer's Garrison. It's a scene made famous by Puritan historians who describe the natives lighting a cart on fire and pushing it into the garrison, hoping to light the garrison on fire, only to be foiled at the last minute by a rainstorm that put the fire out. And the Puritan historians are grasping at straws at this point, looking for divine presence in the war. And this is one of the straws that they grasp upon. So the sites associated with the plantation and the siege are well marked along Foster Hill Road in West Brookfield. After Wheeler's surprise in the siege of Brookfield, Lancaster was attacked for the first time in the war. The town lost 7 or 8 residents, mainly in the outlying parts of town. By the fall of 1675, action has moved to the exposed settlements along the Connecticut River Valley. In September, Captain Richard Beers of Watertown and 36 mounted men led an ox team removing food and supplies from Squawkeag Plantation, which is modern Northfield, which had been attacked and burned. Beers and his troops were ambushed, losing 21 men. It was a very dark day for the English, but not nearly as dark as the next ambush, this time at Muddy Brook, which will forever be known as Bloody Brook in modern-day South Deerfield. Captain Thomas Lathrop from Beverly and 79 soldiers, most from Essex County, were sent to evacuate Deerfield, just as Beers had been sent to evacuate Northfield. The soldiers and teamsters stopped to rest, and they were ambushed. Just like Beers' ambush in Northfield, the English failed to understand or prepare for the skulking way of war. It's a reminder that, again, that what we call English soldiers were really English farmers and merchants. At Bloody Brook, the Nipmuc under Mutwump killed 40 soldiers and 17 teamsters. It was a devastating event for the English, and there was a sense at this point that the Native Americans might very well push 50 years of colonial settlement back to the Atlantic, despite being outnumbered 4-1. Of course, it vies with the Bobbitt Stone and a location in Cumberland, Rhode Island called Nine Men's Misery for the honor of being the first veterans memorial in this country. And I'll show you what I mean. Today, there's a marker showing the mass grave of Lathrop's soldiers and teamsters. It's in the front yard of a private home, and it's considered by the people, at least in South Deerfield, as the oldest surviving monument to veterans in the U.S. Bloody Brook remains the best known of the three, however. In 1838, the site was commemorated with a more formal inscribed memorial. Edward Everett was the keynote speaker. He'd been the governor of Massachusetts and would, many years later, deliver a lengthy speech at a place called Gettysburg, just before Abraham Lincoln gave his own much shorter address. So the first year of the war closed with a single bloodiest day. The Great Swamp Fight occurred on a snowy day in December 1675, when a 1,000-man army led by Josiah Winslow, that included all 3 colonies, Rhode Island, and about 150 friendly Mohegan warriors, attacked a palisaded Narragansett village of men, women, and children in the Great Swamp in South Kingston, Rhode Island. Puritan historians recorded that the fort was unfinished and the English entered by a fallen tree at an exposed opening. It seems more likely that this narrow entrance was intentionally created by Canocha, the Narragansett commander, to ensure that a larger and stronger force would have to attack single file. It's what we might be called in modern military terms a kill box. And that's what happened. The English tried to enter the fort at a single point. They were driven back again and again until finally sheer numbers breached the fort. Once the fighting moved within the fort, the English set it on fire. Everything was destroyed. Shelter, food, supplies. As many as 400 Narragansett women and children were killed. Until this point, the Narragansett had been neutral. Their greatest sin had been taking and starving and displaced Wampanoag women and children. But the Narragansett considered this attack, and still do, unprovoked and a massacre of innocents. And the surviving warriors were enraged and readily entered the war alongside the Wampanoag and Nipmuc. The site of the Great Swamp is marked today by an obelisk. There's a long-standing debate about whether we have found the correct location of the battle, which we cover in detail in the book. Like Wheeler's Surprise, it is another fascinating historical mystery that really challenges our sense of space. I was fortunate to be in touch with Dr. Joseph Granger, who was a URI grad in archaeology in the late 1950s, dug at the supposed site of the Great Swamp Fight. He was kind enough to let me quote from his unpublished manuscript, The Brummel Den. I was contacted a few weeks ago out of the blue by Dr. Granger's niece, who said her uncle is retired, 90 years old, and still going strong, which was good to hear. In the wake of the Great Swamp Fight, it seemed apparent that the goal of the new combined Native American army was to take the war to Plymouth, right to the doorstep of Josiah Winslow. And along the way, they would do as much damage as they could, which meant attacks on Lancaster and Medfield and Sudbury. In February 1676, Lancaster was attacked and the minister's wife, Mary Rowlandson, was captured. Mary would travel with the natives for 11 weeks, and she would be among the first to understand despite a series of impressive military victories, that the Native Americans were growing desperate and hungry, winning constantly on the battlefield, but losing the war of attrition. They had no harvest in 1675. They had no chance to plant in 1676. The site of the Rowlandson garrison used to be marked by this pine tree. Here it is in the upper right in Ellison Morris's 1906 version. And below, when I visited in the early 1990s, the pine tree was still hanging on. Unfortunately, it was on the grounds of Atlantic Union College. That has since closed. And the pine tree was also gone the last time I went to visit it. If you want to visit the spot where Mary was released by the natives or redeemed, you can hike the Mid-State Trail on Wachusett Mountain near Westminster and visit Redemption Rock. So next online in the march to Plymouth by the combined Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett force was Medfield. We know a lot about what happened in Medfield, almost minute to minute and blow by blow, when it was attacked on the morning of February 21st, 1676 by about 300 warriors. Your neighbor, Richard de Sorga, has done a terrific job of capturing the events in Medfield, which knew the attack was coming. 160 or so soldiers from Boston and Cambridge were spread throughout the town. But again, as in Swansea, they gathered in the garrisons with the residents rather than being out on patrol. This defensive tactic of huddling just didn't work. And in the end, we know 17 residents and soldiers were killed, while 32 homes were burned, along with 2 mills, barns, and livestock. We have a good idea of where the garrisons were in Medfield. You can see how compact the area was and how 300 warriors might have been able to infiltrate the town. Except for one garrison, several families gathered in the Stone House, located in what was then the western part of Medfield, but is today Millis, which was the patchwork child of Sherborne. This month's Medfield Historical Society newsletter features an article about new signage that updates the description of the February 21st events in Medfield. And the Bogastow Farm Stone House was of particular interest to me because its discovery occurred after we published our book in 1999, representing some of this good new scholarship and archaeology done since then. And in 2005, Paul Lacroix, who I've never met and may be here tonight, but president of the Millis Historical Society, found the remains of this structure near South End Pond. The findings from these excavations were detailed in Lacroix's publication, Bogastow Farm's Stone House. We think we know that the site was a trading post and a fortification during the mid-1600s. There is also evidence of early ironworking there, making it one of the earliest known iron production sites in New England. There was no sign of a native attack during this February 1676 raid, suggesting that the Native Americans simply left it alone as being too well fortified. That guy in the blue t-shirt is Dr. Emerson Baker, I'm pretty sure, who was digging at the Clark and Lake Trading Post in Maine when I was doing my research. He was very helpful then. He continues to be very helpful. He's at Salem State. He's still a first-class archaeologist, and he seems to show up in my pictures quite often of the war. So, springtime brought the Sudbury fight, another devastating loss for the English, but what I now think of as the dying gasp of the Native coalition. Captain Samuels Wadsworth and Samuel Brocklebank marched their troops into town, were ambushed, regathered, and fought their way up Green Hill. After about 4 hours of fighting, they reached the top of the hill with very little loss and in a defensible position. But this time, the natives start the fire on the hillside. And then it's chaos. Wadsworth, Brocklebank, and 27 of their men were killed. The English soldiers were buried in a mass grave in what is today the Wadsworth Cemetery. Captain Wadsworth's son, Benjamin, was 6 years old when his father was killed. In 1725, Benjamin will become the president of Harvard. And in 1730, he added this beautiful slate stone to remember his father, Captain Brocklebank, and their men. And then in 1835, the cemetery was created around the old burial spot. On the 175th anniversary of the battle, this tall commemorative obelisk was dedicated. So as we come to the end of the war, a quick recap. Dozens of English towns have been attacked. 17 were destroyed and abandoned. Meanwhile, colonial troops keep walking into these devastating ambushes, from Swansea to Wheeler's Surprise to Beer's Ambush to Bloody Brook to the Sudbury Fight. There'll be something called Turner's Fight and Pierce's Fight in Rhode Island. Native warriors dominated the battlefield almost throughout the war, a tribute to their skulking way of war. Major Appleton was able to secure the Connecticut River Valley, but only after Beer's Ambush and Bloody Brook, 2 of the worst days of the war for the English. The death blow will come in August 1676 when Philip was shot and killed at Mount Hope in Bristol. by a band of soldiers under Benjamin Church. Ironically, it will be a Native American who gave away Philip's location and a Native American by the name of Alderman who killed Philip. One of Philip's hands had been scarred in an accident with a musket, so Church cut it off and gave it to Alderman, who would preserve it in a bucket of rum and make his living by exhibiting the hand for pennies at taverns around New England for the rest of his life. Philip's head was sent to Plymouth and exhibited on a pike, as I mentioned, on a main thoroughfare for approximately 25 years, just like Cromwell, a tribute, I think, to his importance. The spot of Philip's death in Bristol is marked. There's also a rock formation nearby called the seat of Metacom. I cannot tell you if he ever sat there or not, but these sites are on the land that Brown recently returned to the Pokanoket. Not long after Philip's death, Church and his men captured Anawan in modern-day Rehoboth. It's a heroic scene in Church's book. He had to carefully climb down this rock face in the dead of night. But it's also worth remembering that Anawan was elderly. He'd been Massasoit's war chief and contemporary, so he was in 70 or 80 something. He's leading mostly women and children who were outgunned and probably starving. We think that as Church grew older, he may have visited Anawan Rock to show the scene to his family members. And it's still an interesting and I think very evocative place to visit today, especially for those of you who appreciate history through being in a sense of place, as I do. It's also the vortex of what we call the Bridgewater Triangle, which I rate with all of the King Philip's caves that I visited. When Anawan was captured, he presented Church with 2 wampum belts, which in figures and flowers, birds and beasts, told the history of the Pokanoket. Church gave these belts to his brother-in-law to present to the king, and along the way they were lost. And they are still missing, despite efforts by people like Dr. Maurice Robbins, the late Dr. Maurice Robbins of the Mass Archaeological Society, who tried to find them in British museums. I believe they exist. I believe someday we will find them. In the meantime, we have modern native craftspeople who have honored their people in history by practicing these ancient crafts with the wampum and belt making. Some of you may have seen this beautiful wampum belt in the Cahoon Museum in Mashpee. It was not intended to try to duplicate the belt that Church received, but to honor its memory. It's a form of survivance, a way to restore continuity and memory that I had talked about earlier. Losses from King Philip's War on both sides were staggering. The English experienced about 1,500 deaths per 100,000 people. The natives experienced death at 10 times that rate. King Philip's War is sometimes referred to as the bloodiest war per capita in American history. As important, these combined losses ended forever a way of life of 2 peoples living peacefully side by side for almost 50 years in New England. Some Native Americans fled to New York and Canada. Many were executed and many were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. But not all. 2 communities, Gayhead of Martha's Vineyard and Mashpee on Cape Cod, were relatively untouched by the war. And Native Americans will be able to perpetuate many of their traditions and stories. In the end, however, King Philip's War will become a template for the forceful removal of Native Americans from the land. King Charles II and British administrators are appalled that our heroic ancestors could not keep the native population in check and almost lost the King's New World holdings. So shortly after the war, the Crown began tightening governance around this part of the world. It had almost ignored for 50 years. Among other actions, for example, it forced Mass Bay and Plymouth colonies together into the province of Massachusetts. From the colonist perspective, however, they had fought a war and they'd won with no support from the mother country. And they were pretty happy about governing themselves for 50 years. Things were going okay. And they will resist this tightening for the next century. And you can see the seeds of the American Revolution being planted in the wake of King Philip's War. One final postscript, and that's about our shoddy treatment of veterans, another legacy of King Philip's War. As Mass Bay and Plymouth colony soldiers were mustering on Dedham Plain, that's now the Hyde Park section of Boston, before the Great Swamp Fight, a message had come from the governor. If they took the Narragansett fort, they would be given a gratuity of land along with their wages. That was in December of 1675. Well, they took the fort. Unfortunately, it would take Massachusetts 59 years until 1734 before veterans and their heirs received the land promised. And I say heirs because there were only a handful of veterans of the battle still alive in 1734. If you are a family historian, there was a book written in 1906, was that magic date, by Massachusetts Congregational minister, historian, and genealogist George Madison Bodge, who spent much of his career in the Boston area. His most famous work, Soldiers in King Philip's War, is a document-driven account that compiled muster rolls, pay lists, enlistments, and campaign narratives linking individual soldiers to battles and towns. Bodge had access to the records of John Hull, who was a wealthy Boston merchant and one of the most important financial figures in Massachusetts. Hull kept detailed account books of payments made to soldiers. Bodge also reconstructed the 7 so-called Narragansett townships that were established to reward the veterans of the Great Swamp Fight. So if you are looking for an ancestor who may have fought in the war, start with Bodge. You may find their children in places like Buxton, Maine, and Amherst, New Hampshire. You will not find them in Greenwich, Massachusetts, however, which is today covered by the Quabbin Reservoir. The one duty we owe history, Oscar Wilde wrote, is to rewrite it. So Ellis and Morris helped pull the narrative together in 1906 for a 20th century audience. Leach perfected the military narrative in the lost years of the war. Jill Lepore reminded us that the war is still being fought. And then Lisa Brooks, Christine DeLucia, and Linda Coombs helped to recover Native American voices and perspectives. I think with every retelling of the story across the centuries, it becomes a little more balanced and a little better understood, and does what history intends us to do, which is not tell a single truth, but to find a number of truths that we can weave together in something that makes sense to us. So thank you for having me this evening. Thanks to Kevin for your support. I have books and I'm happy to sign or inscribe them, and I'm also happy to take questions. Yeah, Kevin.
Eric, I recall reading that the praying Indians in Natick were rounded up during the war and brought into Boston, and I believe some were enslaved and some returned. Is that so? And what generally happened to the so-called praying Indians?
So the praying Indians in Natick and other places were considered threats. And I think many of them would have been loyal to the English, but the English didn't believe that. So they essentially built a concentration camp on Deer Island and put them there in the winter without sufficient lodging or clothing or food, and many of them died. I think the war would have been different if they had been allowed to fight on the side of Massachusetts Bay and perhaps Plymouth, as Benjamin Church tried to get folks in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay to agree to, and Connecticut used effectively during the war with the Mohegan and the Pequot. So it was maybe our first concentration camp in America, and it was completely unfair and unnecessary. They could have at least been given food and clothing and shelter during that period. And they were brought back the following spring when English authorities believed that the threat had passed. But it's not a good story. There are many not good stories in this war, unfortunately, but it's important to know them. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One was the Great Dying. What was the cause?
So we're not sure what it was. Smallpox was a real problem for the Native Americans because they didn't have immunity, but I haven't read anywhere where they said it was smallpox. We just know it was a French fisherman, actually a couple of French fishermen who had it, and the French ship dropped them off in Maine and took off back to France because they didn't want them on board when they went back to France, and they traveled and mixed with the indigenous peoples, and eventually it made its way south. So we don't know what it was, though. Yeah.
And then the second question was maybe more the idea of legacy. Because it was such a significant conflict for a long period of time, are there, sort of generational lessons that have carried forward to today, right? Whether it be military tactics or it's, practices in neighborhoods or it's those kinds of things. Are there lessons learned that we carried on?
Can they be lessons that we haven't learned, but they're still lessons? I remember reading that that children at the time of the American Revolution were still having nightmares about King Philip's War. So 100 years later, it was still part of the conscious memory of the people here in New England. So it was a big deal. I would say that the treatment of veterans would have been one of the legacies of the war, that the run-up to the American Revolution, the fact that the colonists had been given free rein to really govern themselves for 50 years. Of course, the English were fighting the Spanish, they were fighting the French, they were fighting the Dutch. They couldn't be bothered too much with what was going on in the New World. But that's not the colonists' fault. The colonists got used to self-governance, and that will be a legacy of the war right up to the Revolution. And look, the issue of guns, the English had been forbidden to sell guns to the Native Americans. But the Dutch were nearby in New York and the French were nearby in Canada, and the Native Americans could get guns and the best stuff that Europe was making in these flintlocks. So it will be 1794 when Washington establishes Springfield and Harper's Ferry to finally make guns for America. The big issue here was not so much there were a number of natives who were blacksmiths and they could repair guns, but nobody could make gunpowder. And until there's a plant established in Milton toward the very end of the war, but people were constantly running out of gunpowder. Knotchet says at the Great Swamp, if I had known how little gunpowder we had, I might not have picked the fight here. Yeah.
Just two quick tidbits relating to Sherborne that
Mhm.
might be interesting.
Mhm.
One is in that picture of the stone house. that you had
Yep.
there.
Yep.
There's a person in the front row there who happens to be the Sherborne historian who was there at the dig.
Great.
I think we covered a lot of the artifacts. Betsy Johnson, you probably don't, it's too modest to tell.
Where is she?
She's right over there.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, and
There
that,
it
we
is.
know exactly where that site is.
Mhm.
Yeah. In fact, Betsy is in, I think, one of the pictures. And we also, it's now about to be opened by the trustees of preservation of the property, so go look at it. The other thing that's interesting is, you talked about the Brady movies, you're familiar with Daniel Lucan.
Mhm.
The book you briefly had up.
Right.
about their suffering, which was a whole interesting story in itself, but Daniel Lucan's son was the first minister at the first parish in Sherborne.
He was.
And right after the war, he took congregants from that church and they walked to Natick to preach to the praying Indians who came
Really?
back after the Deer Island incident.
Really?
Yeah, so Sherborne
Fantastic.
has some really interesting
Right.
connections to it. It's not unusual.
Thank you. There's a pattern to how these towns get established. And the problem in Sherborne is the war starts just as it's starting that cycle. So it gets disrupted for a few years before it gets back on track. Yeah.
So could you say a little bit more about King Philip's role in the war and leadership of the war on the native side? And I ask because one recent history suggests that he was one of many players, maybe not even the most important one on the native side, but after the war, they were talking about how, rewriting history
Mhm.
needed a quick summary catchphrase for what this was about and who the enemy was, and so it all attached to him.
Right.
Wonder what you understand about.
So generally, Knotchet, who I mentioned as a Narragansett at the Great Swamp Fight, the Narragansett is considered the finest Native American military commander of the war. But there were Nipmuc named Mutwamp and Matunis, who were also considered very good tactical leaders among the Nipmuc. Philip, we know, was with Mary Rowlandson. And Weetama was there too. So we know where he was during that period. And in that first winter, he goes to New York. We know that as well, to try to recruit Mohawk to get guns and to get gunpowder. And Governor Andros, who's going to be a pain for Massachusetts soon after the war, has inspired the Mohawk to turn against him. And he actually loses men. He comes back with less men, no guns, and no reinforcements for the war. That might have changed things significantly had he been successful there. So we know there were some diplomatic ties going on. Occasionally we find him at a battle because Mary Rowlandson will write about it in her text, but we're really pretty unsure about his whereabouts during most of the war. There's no reason to think he was, they tried to show him as a coward in the later, that he was always fleeing, the first to flee. But I don't think that's accurate either. I just think we don't know. And, we write history that we need at the time, right? Yeah, yeah.
What were the symptoms of nuclear famine. Don't know what it was, but people must have seen like the symptoms.
Yeah, that's a great question. It would, I believe that there was rashes, there were boils, and it took about 48 hours for someone to die. Right, so it was very, very fast. I'm not a doctor, so I'm not sure what that means, but it was not good. It had to do, I think, I'm going a little out of my lane here, but the Europeans quite often lived close to their animals. In fact, the animals were sheltered in their homes in a lot of cases, which created a kind of immunity for certain diseases that the Native Americans did not have because they did not do that. So and the head is gruesome and the hand is gruesome, but that's what everyone wants. If I speak to a fourth grade, I get, "Dear Mr. Schultz, thank you for telling us about the hand. Thank you for telling us about the hand." Yeah.
The Rocky Narrows reservation here in Sherburne, which bounds the Charles River, there's a site called, mythically, I suspect, King Philip's Overlook.
Yep.
Is there any evidence at all that he ever wandered through this?
No, not that I know of. Not that I know of. If you, I mean, those are the kinds of places that I then try to go back and figure out where it was first sourced, right? In the old days, you had to go to a library and find the PhD dissertation on the back that had been stuffed away. But now it's a little bit easier with digital archives to find that stuff. But I'm imagining we're going to find a sermon in 1876 or 1875 that mentions it as the first time. I know it wasn't mentioned in Mather or Hubbard because I read those. So yeah.
You know, I've tried to track that back. The earliest reference that I have been able to find is in the 1970s.
Really? Well, you know, it's a touchy subject because Norton's a great place. Norton has King Philip's King. Don't tell people in Norton King Philip wasn't there. It's not, they don't want to hear that. And I understand that. And it's part of the funny kind of ambience that comes with the war 350 years later, that people want to be associated with these folks. So, but yeah.
Some things that, you know, because Rawlinson was captured in Lancaster, Medfield was right after Lancaster. There have been legendary statements that King Philip was somewhere around the Medfield raid. But as Betsy said, I don't know if any was validated. There's also that famous note that was left. About that note.
John the printer? Yeah.
The bridge.
Yes.
And that, you know, only certain people could have written that note, and maybe it was, you know, someone who worked closely with King Philip.
Right.
That issue as well, but that's all that I.
Yeah. So it was Simon the printer. I think he had apprenticed, right? He had apprenticed with a printer in Cambridge. Right? Yeah. And he knew how to write. And it was an intimidating note, right? It was intimidation.
Well, I just thought it was on 27th Bridge, but Betsy had everything else. She knows more than what I need. So she thinks that in Paul LaCroix, they put together, Betsy can tell you, did research. I'm not sure that's the actual bridge because they don't even know who's there at the time.
Interesting.
But it's across Charles and Gettysburg. Exactly, Death Bridge. And it was a note that is fascinating because it as you said, it was very intimidating, but it had all sorts of meaning about taking the cows and we'll fight until the death, and you know.
Remember that in order for the English to demonstrate that they possessed the land, it was important to have farms and livestock. So when the natives were killing the livestock, it was because they were taking the land back in a sense from the English. But look, I think if I write this book that I'm not going to write, there's going to be a chapter on local historians because I think they are some of the crown jewels of New England. And people who protect our small history in the towns are really, really important to us. So go ahead.
As far as the bridge is concerned, I also tried to track that back. And I found no mention in Medfield or Sherman records of any bridge on Route 27 prior to 1740, when it was being repaired. But even on the first map that shows that area, there's no bridge shown in.
Really?
You know, why build a bridge when you got a piece of port? You
Sure.
got other things to do.
Sure. Good point.
So I think it was the Great Bridge, which would have been on.
Where they fled after the cannon was shot and they fled.
Yes.
Yeah.
That would have been across the Charles at Bridge Street in Medfield,
Mhm.
sort of it, and where it meets, I forget, West Street, I think it is.
Right.
Well, once again, we thank.
Thanks,
Eric for
everyone.
coming out and enlightening us. We'll mill around for a little bit, but we do want to vacate the premises by about 8:30 or so. Eric does have some books here. Otherwise, thanks for coming out. We'll see you next time.